Okay, so at some point in the last decade, I wrote this down. I made a point saying, what makes art good? Might as well get right to the point. Here's my opinion. And by the way, I heard an interesting comment about opinions and from Jonathan Forrest. It was something to the effect of, it's my opinion, and if you don't like it, I can change it. So if you don't like this, maybe I'll change it. We'll see. Anyway, there's a lot of bad and mediocre illusionistic or representational art. Likewise, there's a lot of bad or mediocre semi-abstract or fully non-objective art. As well, there's a lot of bad conceptual, installation, and performance art. Why do I think a lot of art in general is bad or mediocre? Because it lacks honesty or personal expression and surprise. And somehow, I mean, honesty is kind of always surprising because it sneaks up on you. We're so not used to it somehow. So most artists, and I think this is important, most artists make what they think looks like art. Most often it is a result of what they were taught, what they've been exposed to, or what's currently popular. It's the most difficult thing as an artist is to actually make what is truly personal and is truly, therefore, art in one aspect. I come from a period that was very strong, I'll call it formalist painting and sculpture. I grew up, I was taught with that mindset. I still believe it. It was what I was taught and what I've thought about, and I questioned it all the time. But I have been labeled a formalist, usually in a derisive way. I don't really know what a formalist is. However, I do know that I believe in making judgments about art, and that's the area where I think formalism separates a little bit from some other art areas. I believe, I think something is either good or not so good, and I believe that you can make and you should make those judgments in regards to whatever you're doing. I also believe that visual art is about giving the viewer something to look at rather than talk about or hear about. And that the medium one chooses can and should play a role in what is presented by the artist. I believe, as Robert Motherwell stated in the early 1950s, that every intelligent painter, I like that term, so if you don't agree, think about it, that every intelligent painter holds the entire culture of modern painting in his or her head, and anything he or she paints is both an homage as well as a critique. These were student works. These come out of the teaching that was going on at the U of S at the time. So I went to school 64 to 68. So these would have been me just right after school. First year of painting, drawing, etc., you drew, I'll say, Renaissance realism. You were required to work from the models in the still life and get control of value, of light and dark, and look seriously. So, then we kind of quickly in the second year jumped up past the 1400s and 1500s into like the early 1800s with Impressionism and Fauvism and so on in painting practice. Then it was geared to you continuing on and becoming a structurist. So this was done at home, and I'm going to point out, I think they reference to some extent 50 years later, which is now, in that, there's this rectangular shape with objects on it, and you'll see a lot of rectangular shapes coming up with objects, colored shapes, and so on, not so related to realism like fruit or table things, bowls and other stuff. But it's it's in my roots is what I'm trying to say. So if you keep some of these in mind as we go through, you'll see some connections. What I'm working on today, I will probably carry over to tomorrow, but not necessarily. Generally have like series, I'll call them. So there's 1 or 2 or 3 years or sometimes more of me trying to resolve or to develop a thought direction. And it's quite a jump, and you'll see the jumps as we go through it. I tend to rework pictures as time goes by. All the shapes were there. These are original, and there would have been original shapes under here, but this gridding is me probably 15 years later, no, 20 years, whatever, coming back saying, maybe that needs a little weight over there, and so bang, add it. The thought being, of course, it'll make it better. I would define these shapes like a sort of a deck of cards being spread out to some extent. These are, I identified the whole group as fans. So, various, and I did, again, probably a couple of hundred of these. But I would identify the shape, and then I work with very thin acrylic that had gesso in it, and I would just pour the gesso into the shape and then spread it around. So, you get variation. That was the beginning, without me really thinking consciously of it, in making the paint more interesting. It's not just the shape, but the paint surface and the activity within it. And then, so just as an example, 88. I have a bunch of these. You're seeing literally the tip of icebergs. I did a whole group of circles. Now again, that's its influence. There was not an uncommon layout to be used in this time period. I started doing rubbings. The gel in the paint, I retained the thickness of it as a kind of a ridge. So I had a template or two of thick ridges on another canvas and in concentric circles. So then I would lay that down on the platform, put this canvas on top, and rub it with like black in this case, and then stain. This is all on the front. Sometimes I stain from the back. If you put soap detergent into very thin acrylic paint, it will penetrate the canvas. So I would stain it from the back and it would come through, which was always a surprise. It was kind of like doing a ceramic glaze, you never quite know what. It's always interesting and it's a surprise. So then into the 90s, I started doing these, what I called furrows. And you'll notice the ridges that I was referencing before. These were done starting at the studio downtown, and then I continued here into the early 2000s of these repetitive happy faces. It's the closest I've come to actually referencing the landscape. In the fall, and in the spring, and they're either planting or taking off the crops. There are these ridges, which are called furrows. I just got into the habit of free swinging. The last century is over with there. So now we'll move into modern times, so to speak. But tape off each section, run a color through, and then I have a series of squeegees where I've snipped out. So, it's like, you'll probably all know that you lay stuff down for linoleum glue and whatever. And so that's the lines that you see. They're actual grooves. And then I would overpaint and overpaint and overpaint and retain undercolors, sometimes multiple colors underneath. So there was a series of those, and it became kind of an all-over singular image, if you will. It was obviously not so much about a singular thing, about itself, so to speak. And then we're going to do some more leaps and bounds here, and we're getting more up to date. The horizontal bars started to become wood, and I quite like this picture. But it carries on that horizontal stuff. But I started using wood, as I was saying, and these are just wooden strips. I would often use coroplast as examples, and I just basking tape it down and have a look at it. And I think this was one of the first ones, and it was maybe one of the better ones. There's a bunch of different colors underneath that I let be retained, And then I also like the subtle sequencing of colors on the surface. In particular, it was that addressing something that wasn't the typical painting. Paint on wood, does it make any difference whether it's on wood or canvas? Or whether you stick wood on a copper plate? Hopefully it's art. So I did some larger versions of this. But this was almost like a print. In fact, one might even call it that. I had a template. And you can see the rubbing around, so it's identical, same size. I put little strips, maybe 1/4 inch or so wide strips of wood, and stuck them onto one of my panels. You can see it's wet and somewhat dry in different places. So it created this fold. The fold, to me, was kind of like the blind you just saw in a funny way, is that it's something we all know. I mean, it's an obvious, maybe I see it as obvious, as being a bent shape. Can you get away with a bent shape? Jesus, talk about low level of subject matter, you know, it's a bent shape, right? So, you have to, or I had to try to make this work. And so I go back to that whole point of activate the surfaces, activate the paint, and activate what goes on around. So little things like how this comes over into the, I'll call it the matte. So that's kind of what mostly would be perceived as support information. But in this case, it's almost on the equal footing with the shape itself. I think you see both. They're both critical. I have different ways of putting paint down, and in this case, I think I would scrape it down, and then just when it's just about dry, I roll it, and it picks up the excess and leaves some rubbed out areas, you know. These are all quite current. In fact, these two are, I'm going to call them, you know, within the last couple of months. I think of some of these as being tough paintings. Tough in that, have I got enough? Is the substance sufficient? Is the visual imagery sufficient to hold the viewer? Or is it just a red shape, for instance, you know? As I say, the one on the far right, I still like it, and it talked about the shadows. Like, they're not only in relief, and there's support structure underneath, and it's not thought out. I didn't think I was going to do that. It evolved. And then I realized to get away with it, I had to, you know, lift these up. So, you know, stick stuff underneath and glue it down. And then there's this one, which actually has ties to the far one. And this is, again, by the way, it takes me a long time to paint these things. Sometimes a year or more. You know, I work on platforms. I will sometimes get tired and I'll take them off the platform and roll them up if I can roll them. Most of them have wood now, so I pin them to the wall. But eventually, it's sort of like you have to clear your head of what you're trying to do and come back to it like you would be coming back to somebody else's work. I try to finish in a setting, you know, but I never can, and I almost have to accept that. So this one, for instance, you see the strips, I had cardboard. I don't commit right off the bat. I've learned my lessons. You know, I had cardboard in a different configuration on these shapes, and it sat for months, whatever. Then I cut some wood and I put a couple of strips of wood down, and it sat for months with different colors underneath, by the way. And then one day, just out of the corner of my eye, I'm looking at this, and it's, you know, it's not stretched. It's on a 4-foot square platform that I use. Had some cardboard in hand and stuck it down. I thought, let's finish this. So I cut wood to replace the cardboard, glued it down, painted it, and I thought, it's the best work I've ever done. It's okay. It's something about the simplicity of the thing. It's two bent yellow shapes. If you don't like it, there's not much else to look at, you know. I see it, as I mentioned right off the bat, about surprise. sort of getting away with something that is quite simple in and of itself, or in the concept, and making it a little bit more interesting somehow than what it should be. You know, I'll use the word meaning without it being the way it might be incorrectly interpreted. There's no meaning per se behind it, but meaning as engagement. If it offers some visual stimulus or whatever, then I think it's of interest, and hence maybe art. And wood, again, bit of squeegee stuff, you know, and same there, and a bit of underpaint showing, not so much in this one. But back to your point about the shadows too, you know, like even that hint, well, it starts to come in with, you know, putting an underpaint down and then retaining a little bit of that. So it's not necessarily a black, dark shadow, but you know, well, here, you get it. It sort of makes this, I'm sorry, I'm in your way here, but, you know, it makes this read somewhat like it's in relief, like, whereas this is in relief, you know, as is this. So I seem to feel the need to actually have that color shape come out a little bit. That's just me, you know. Whereas my past, it was always just lay it on the canvas, sometimes with thicker paint or whatever. But now, many times I try to, or quite often, I try to pump up the surface. I didn't mind the picture. It was blue on the left. You can see where that bend, or the, you know, directional change in the black at the top, you know, dips down and connects down below. That was a split. So there was blue on the left and pink on the right. Clever, two double color of pink and blue, right? And then these shapes were floating in. But I kept looking at it and it just wasn't clicking. So I thought, take it, you know, cover it up and deal with it. So, I mean, this is, you get multiple paintings and one comes complete with a set of, but those were original. But I think I started to look at it and thinking, either I'm going to paint over these or I'm going to paint over those others. And I kind of started to like the black-white thing, period, right? So we'll see. I have no idea where this is going to go, but for now, it's an instant cover-up. So this is Darby Bannard, and he's got these aphorisms for artists, a little short, to-the-point statements. So it's, ugliness in art is the last refuge of the uninspired. Darby was a formalist. So then he says, as art gets more popular and the market gets bigger, as it has since World War II, competition increases. Art, which has no evident usefulness, is forced to shout, "Look at me." Art could try to be beautiful, of course, but beauty by its nature is rather soft-spoken and reticent, and the art public, in its persistent vulgarity, confuses repulsiveness with profundity. This fosters quantities of art taken to grotesque extremes. Many years ago, Clem Greenberg said, all profoundly original work looks ugly at first. This should be updated to all profoundly ugly works looks original at first. So, art is in the materials, don't look for it somewhere else. When rhetoric elevates the spiritual over the material, art slips away and hides. As Oscar Wilde said, the true mystery of the world is the visible, not the invisible. Good art makes the material and the spiritual the same thing.